In fact, it was so neat, we almost started the program late, so that's kind of cool. Welcome, everyone, to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Election Day here in West Virginia. It is Tuesday. It is the 10th day of September in the year 2016. And before I do anything else, let me encourage all of you who are listening live to not miss Bob Kincaid this evening. He is scheduled to appear on MSNBC with Chris Hayes at 8 p.m., and I believe he said yesterday at 11 p.m. as well. They are obviously going to be doing live coverage of the election results, and they'll have one of those panels with Chris Matthews and Rachel Maddow and a number of the others sitting around sharing results on the election. And this could be a Bernie Sanders victory. All the numbers are kind of pointing in that direction, and even Hillary's staff has pretty much conceded that that Bernie has a good chance of winning this one. So we'll see. And of course, the reality is, as it often is in our political system, it seems more and more, it's hard to pin down. We don't know whether the support for Bernie in West Virginia is support for Bernie or whether it's alienation toward Hillary Clinton, because Hillary is quite unpopular here in West Virginia. On the other hand, Donald Trump is quite popular. And chances are very, very likely that he'll win big in West Virginia. And of course, with no competition left in the Republican Party anyway, chances are there'll be a big turnout for Donald Trump. But he's very, very popular here. Anyway, welcome to the Virtual Center, to this Tuesday edition of our program. I do invite you to call in. We'll be finishing up at the beginning of our program today. We're going to be finishing up the issue we began yesterday, which was the criticism of Bernie Sanders and the extent to which Bernie Sanders is being the charges of Bernie Sanders being a socialist are accurate. And we finished at the end of our program yesterday by looking at some of the text of a letter written by none other than James Madison in the year 1829. And Madison this was late in life for Madison. It goes further. It goes much further than to say he was in his retirement years, which is the way that his letters are divided. If you look at the Rotunda collection, they are divided, and the last section is the retirement years. But the fact of the matter is, as many of us know, Madison was elected president in the year 1812, and 1808. Jefferson was president from 1800 to 1808, and then in 1808, Madison was elected, then reelected in 1812. Of course, Madison was president during the famous War of 1812, which is frequently referred to in the textbooks as Mr. Madison's War. And then, of course, after he left the White House, he remained politically active. But by the time you get into the late 1820s, he's in his retirement years. And this particular letter that we're looking at was written in 1829. And Madison dies in his mid-80s, in the year 1836. So this is 7 years prior to his death in his mid-80s. So what that would mean, obviously, is that Madison writes this letter, and he's in his mid to late 70s when he writes this letter. But as I move in that direction, I used to think that being in your 70s was old. But I don't anymore, and I think all of us I hear people say that all the time. I used to think that 50 was old until I turned 50. And then I said, oh, boy, I just feel as good as I did when I was in my 30s. And people say the same thing in their 60s, and I'm finding it in the 70s as well. So anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you today. We would love to hear from you. We have a phone number that is dedicated to the off chance, or And I say that advisedly because I really do invite you to take advantage of it and call in our program and give folks, others, an opportunity to hear your voice, your ideas, your thoughts, your concerns, your questions, your fears, your hopes, whatever they might be, related to today's program. Today is election day. It's kind of an up day for a lot of people, and I think all of us need to keep in mind that not everybody in the world has the opportunity that we have to go vote and express their opinion on issues. And I don't want to sound like a civics textbook here, but I do believe it's very, very important. And in fact, the irony is, I'm beginning to realize that it's more important than I did for a number of years. I used to be one of those people during the 60s and 70s who was an advocate who believed very strongly in the idea of not voting as a protest. But the fact of the matter is, not voting as a protest may make you feel good, but it doesn't do a whole heck of a lot for the system. Because the fact of the matter is, the people who make the real decisions are able to take your decision to not vote and assign it a rationale that may conform to your desire to establish a protest, but most likely won't. Most likely they will attribute your refusal to vote as laziness, as indifference, as support for the current status quo, because if you really had things that you didn't like, you'd be voting. So the irony of the situation, by not voting, you give those whose opinions are not your own the opportunity to assign a motive to you that more than likely is not accurate. The only way to deny them that opportunity is to vote. And I think that's very significant. I was a big advocate in the 60s because the fact of the matter is, there's no question, the way the system is organized, large numbers of people who don't vote threatens the security and the stability of our republic. There's no question. Because our republic functions around large numbers of people casting their ballots. And the old ideas, the classic ideas of consent of the governed and all of those things are driven by the fact that large numbers of people in the republic vote. And so there's no question that if you can persuade large numbers of people to not vote, then it is a way to send a message to the powers that be. The problem is you have to reach so many people and encourage them to join you. The chances are you're not going to be successful because the people in power will interpret your decision not to vote as a vote of confidence for them. So not only do you lose your opportunity to express your opinion on issues, but you give the people who least deserve your support the right to assign you a motive. And I think that combination doesn't work if you think about it. So anyway, I didn't even intend to get into that, but today is election day, and it's kind of an up day, a very positive day. And I've seen a number of people today walking around with little "I voted" buttons on, stickers on their lapel. And I early voted on Saturday. I think I mentioned this yesterday. And on Saturday, which was at the end of early voting, you got a sticker that said "I early voted," and I got one of those. So. And it does make you feel good. And, of course, I was telling Bob Kincaid yesterday before we went on the air that this year is a new experience for me because this is the first time I ever ran for anything. This is the first time I ever saw my name on a ballot. And I'll be honest, and I was telling Bob this yesterday, I didn't even think about it. When I went to vote on Saturday, I was just going to vote. I didn't even think about the fact that I was on the ballot. And so as I was flipping from one page to the other, and of course we're not talking about pages, we're talking about digital voting, computer voting machines. But as I was going from one page to the other, suddenly I came to the House of Delegates votes, and I saw my name at the top. And I really had to pause for a moment and think about that. It's pretty unnerving. For me, at least, it was. It's an experience I never had before. It made me appreciate, there was a speech that Bernie, I believe it was an interview. I don't think it was a formal speech. I think it was an interview sometime over the last couple of months. There have been so many that I couldn't remember which one. But Bernie Sanders was talking about his wish that his parents had lived long enough to see his name on the ballot for the office of President of the United States. They'd never believe it. And I heard him say that, and at the time I was impressed. But until yesterday, when I experienced a little bit of that myself, I really didn't appreciate the emotion that is associated with Bernie's comment. So I hope all of you who can vote, or maybe you are in a place where the primaries are already passed, but the fall elections are coming up. And I think one of the things that we've dealt with here at the Virtual Center in previous months, and we'll continue to deal with it, I think, is the extent to which this particular election this fall, and I know candidates say that every fall, every election is painted to be the most important election in the history of the nation and all of these other things. We know that. But if you think about what's happening in this country now, this one might actually be just that. And so, but the fact of the matter is, I also know that if you're listening to the Virtual Center or you're listening to the Hedron Radio Network, you're going to vote. You're a voter. You're an advocate. You're a participant. You are actively involved in the political process in one way or another. You're informed, you're educated, you care, and you will participate. And the fact of the matter is, when you look at that audience, this audience on Head On and here at the Virtual Center, and you compare it with the with the entire population nationally, it's a pretty darn special group when you think about it. My phone's ringing in the background. I apologize for that. It's a pretty special group, it seems to me. So my hat's off to you. Credit to you, I think, on that. Our phone number, and again, we do trust that you will share your thoughts and your ideas with our listeners, as well as with me, very honestly, because I want to hear your ideas and your thoughts as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. 4676, of course, translates into HORN, horn, on your phone keypad. If you would like to share your thoughts with me in an email, and for some reason, one reason or another, you're reluctant to go on the air, I can understand that. The most important thing is to get your ideas down, get your ideas out there. And if you'd like to do it in an email, I'd love to hear from you, and I'll do the spade work. I'll put it on the air for you if indeed what you're saying seems to warrant other people knowing about it. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And I do call your attention to our Facebook page. If you are a user of Facebook, just go to the homepage, and in the search box, type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. And there are a number of postings there that I've put on the Facebook page I think we've had it now for 5 or 6 months. And I've probably put 15 to 20 opinion-based postings on the Facebook page. Issues that frequently, not always, but often have come up or will come up on programs here at the Virtual Center. Documents that we've looked at, particular Federalist papers that we've discussed on air. Letters, and of course we're dealing with a letter written by James Madison in 1829. We started that yesterday. So if you look on our Facebook page, I think you'll see that the most recent posting, the one that most of the reactions are coming into now, is a posting that I put on there the day before, I believe Sunday. And in it, I made the point that several days ago, I had addressed the Hoppy Kercheval criticism of Bernie Sanders' campaign positions on issues. And I spent quite a bit of time on that. That was one posting on Facebook. But on that posting on Facebook, I didn't include the piece about the part about James Madison, which is the second half of the story. And that's the part we're going into now. So actually, the entire story of the idea of Bernie Sanders being alleged to be a socialist, and some questions or concerns or criticisms of that theory, and then relying on this 1829 letter of James Madison to validate my argument, my position that Bernie Sanders is not a socialist at all, that he is what we would call a social democrat, and that I believe he's actually done himself a disservice by referring to himself as a democratic socialist, because the very word socialist gives his opponents all the ammunition they need, because socialism is one of those loaded words in our vocabulary, in our political vocabulary in this nation, that raises all sorts of flags with all sorts of different people. Everybody claims to know what socialism is about, and almost everybody believes it's bad. And so their understanding of socialism may not be that accurate, but their conviction that they are correct about socialism is that accurate. And so therefore, by intentionally labeling yourself a socialist, you're raising flags before people even have a chance to wrestle with or to deal with the positions that you're taking on issues. So I think you do yourself a disservice. I think Bernie's done himself a disservice. But be that as it may, it seems to me that if you can relate James Madison and Bernie Sanders and suggest that their positions on issues are quite similar in a lot of ways, I think you would be doing an awful lot to bring a note of credibility to Bernie Sanders and to Bernie Sanders' campaign. So with that, I'd like to return to this particular issue, because I really do believe it's important. And you'll remember yesterday, we were actually into the 1829 letter of James Madison. But I know that there might be some folks who weren't with us yesterday. So I want to just take a couple of minutes, and I will try to make it as short as I can, to kind of review the background to the introduction of James Madison into this controversy. And as we talked yesterday, and as we talked last week in our final program, a week ago today, in fact, we looked at the Hoppy Kercheval piece, the criticism of Bernie Sanders. And I'm not going to get into the criticism of Hoppy Kercheval's piece that I have. I think you can see that on Facebook. But as I said yesterday, and I'll repeat, I do believe that when you read Hoppy's entire article, you begin to get a sense that this article is really more about him than it is about Bernie Sanders. Because the fact of the matter is, many of the things that he alleges about Bernie Sanders are not valid. And I'm not suggesting that he's lying or that he's trashing Bernie Sanders or anything like that. I'm not doing that. I don't have the information. I don't have the basis on which to allege that. What I am saying is that if he indeed labels Bernie Sanders a socialist, then he really doesn't understand socialism. Because if you look at Bernie Sanders' positions on certain issues, if Bernie Sanders was a socialist, he wouldn't be taking those positions on issues. He wouldn't be breaking up private banks. He'd be eliminating them. He wouldn't be advocating more government regulation and more government control of the final sector. He'd be advocating that government take control of the private sector. He wouldn't be looking to raise the minimum wage in order to give more people an opportunity to make it in our free enterprise system. He'd be openly trashing the free enterprise system and suggesting that capitalism at root is unfair to the majority of the people. He's not doing that. So the reality is then that Bernie Sanders may advocate some positions which are very close to socialism, may actively support programs which call for or advocate bigger government and more government management and involvement in the economy. But I would suggest to you there's quite a gap between free enterprise capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other. There's a lot of room between those to maneuver and to play around. There's a lot of places that you can come down between those two poles that may suggest that you lean more in one direction than you do in another, but not enough that you warrant the name socialist. And in fact, there is some serious question. There are really solid arguments to suggest that the United States is really among the least capitalist nations in the modern developed world. That in effect, when you look at the role that government plays in our economy and the number of areas and places that government is involved in managing society and managing the economic livelihood of citizens, you can make a very strong case for the fact that America, the United States, is not capitalist at all, really. So maybe we're beginning the discussion about Bernie Sanders in the middle rather than way over where capitalism resides. A thought. But the fact of the matter is, Hoppy Kercheval does indeed conclude that Bernie Sanders is a socialist, that his ideas won't work, that the cost of the proposals that he is putting forth for big government would cost the nation trillions of dollars. The number that Richard Rubin from the Wall Street Journal uses is $15.3 trillion, which is an outrageous price. But on the other hand, what makes this criticism of Bernie unfair is that Rubin's predictions of a $15+ trillion bill for Bernie's programs neglects to take into consideration the impact of those programs on reducing that bill. You're taking Medicare out of everybody's budget. You're taking the cost of health insurance, health care, out of every family's budget in this country. Granted, you're talking about raising taxes in order to cover health care costs. But in the process, you're talking about making it unnecessary for each individual working person to fund their own health care directly. You're eliminating the cost of college. You're eliminating the trillions of dollars in higher education debt that saddles so many of our young people for years and years and years. My wife is in her 60s, and she just got her college loan paid off last year. But more power to her, she did pay it off. A lot of people are declaring, well, you can't bankrupt that debt. That debt doesn't go away. Even if you declare bankruptcy, it doesn't cover the higher education debt. So when you take that bill out of people's annual expenses, the cost of education or education loans, and you take health care out of people's budgets, then you're making a substantial debt in that multi-trillion dollar bill that Bernie's programs would cost. And I can't, there's no way that I can determine exactly what the numerical results of that consideration would be. But the fact of the matter is, not even giving it consideration, it seems to me is an indication of how loaded the attack against Bernie Sanders is. How one-sided the criticism of Bernie's programs are. But more important than that is the statement, or a few statements in the article in question, Hoppy Kercheval's piece, which appeared in the West Virginia Gazette, Charleston Gazette, a week ago Friday, I believe, earlier in May. The title of the article is Feeling the Burn. Not so much. And in that piece, Kercheval, in two places, specifically accuses Bernie Sanders' socialism. He makes the comment that Sanders aims for government to further file down the edges of capitalism while spreading around the wealth. And a little bit later in the article, he talks about Bernie's quixotic socialist dreams. So the implication is, without question, that the major criticism of Bernie Sanders in this article is that his programs are socialist, and that he is indeed a socialist, which he calls himself. The fact of the matter is There's, as I mentioned a few moments ago, there's quite a difference between capitalism on one hand and socialism on the other. There's a lot of room to maneuver between those two poles. And clearly between those two poles, a little bit left of center, actually, a little bit closer to socialism than to capitalism, is what we call progressivism. An active, aggressive, visible government that is actually involved in governing the society, governing the nation, in the interests of all the citizens in it. Following to the letter the preamble to the Constitution itself, which lists as one of the goals of the document to promote the general welfare. The debate here, the issue, we've been around and around on this in previous months, because it seems to be the basis of the real debate here, is a clear definition of what government's principal role is, principal objective is. Is government's principal job to govern in the public interest? In other words, to so govern and manage society that the most people possible are living the best life possible? Or is government's principal job, principal objective, to protect values like the sanctity of private property? And what that question does is raise yet another question. And that is private property the means to a better quality of life for citizens? Or is private property the goal, the end in itself? Is private property more important than people? I think that's very, very important. I think it's a question that's always there, but not very often articulated, not very often asked. I think it needs to be asked and considered more often. To what extent is freedom to pursue property more important than the people who live in the society? And where this becomes even muddier, even more blurry, is when you take that one step further and you ask the question, not is property more important than people, but is system more important than people? Is the free enterprise system more important than the people it is designed to serve? Because if you agree that it is, and many people do, many people would argue that if you do damage to this system, you are doing damage to the opportunities to be made available to generations of citizens unborn. And so therefore, it's more important to protect the system than it is to take care of the people in it. And so the fact of the matter is that reality, if that is your reality, and there are many people who subscribe to that, if that is your morality, then that becomes the basis of your ability to justify doing horrible things to people, or let me rephrase that, not doing things for people that people need in order to survive. Sacrificing some people in the interest of the system that you believe is most important to the opportunities of people to come. That, it seems to me, is one hell of a moral question and an ethical dilemma. But I think it's an important one. And I think it's a question that we need to ask and need to consider. Before we get to James Madison, let me include here a rather brief mention of Theodore Roosevelt. Many of you will remember that some months ago, probably well over a year ago, we spent time here at the Virtual Center looking at Roosevelt's very famous speech delivered in Osawatomie, Kansas in 2010 to veterans of the Civil War, to Union veterans. And in that speech, Roosevelt explained and introduced to his audience the idea of what he called the new nationalism. That speech is the clearest, most detailed explanation of Roosevelt's progressivism as how he saw the relationship between government and corporations and the private sector. And at the time, Roosevelt was articulating the views of progressives. And in 1912, of course, he gets into the heated contest for president between him, Woodrow Wilson, and the traditional Republican in the race, William Howard Taft. What a lot of people fail to recognize when they read about this, because most books, most textbooks, most history classes tend to focus on the differences between Wilson's progressivism and Roosevelt's progressivism. I would suggest to you that it seems to be more important that the two of them together secured about 85 to 90% of the vote in the 1912 election. Not only did Taft come in third, he came in a dismal third. The bulk of the nation's thinking at that time, as evidenced in that election, was in the progressive direction. And once you accept that, then you can begin to look at the differences and the nuances between Wilson and Roosevelt. But in that speech, Roosevelt is talking about exactly what we're talking about here. Roosevelt is advocating programs and actions by government in order to regulate the economy and regulate corporations, corporate behavior, in much the same way that Bernie Sanders is talking about it in the election campaign of 2016. He's talking about government regulating the behavior of the private sector, regulating the behavior and the activities on Wall Street, breaking up the biggest banks because they're too big to fail. They were too big to fail in 07 and 08 to the point that they had to be bailed out to the tune of billions of taxpayer dollars. And the fact of the matter is, since 07 and 08, most of these institutions have not made any substantial changes in their behavior or their activity. They're still doing the same things today that they did in 07 and 08, which brought on the Great Recession. Roosevelt was dealing with the same kind of issues in 2010. Corporate behavior, unregulated corporate behavior. A Supreme Court that was interpreting the Constitution in ways that denied government the right to govern, or the power to govern in the public interest, by putting the emphasis on private property as if it was an unalienable right. And we spent quite a bit of time here on the Virtual Center several months ago on looking at the question about private property being an unalienable right. We looked at the Scottish philosophers. We looked at Adam Smith and Hutchison. We looked at a number of other philosophers who raised serious questions about that same thing. We looked at John Locke himself, who's the godfather of free enterprise capitalism to conservatives. And we even saw in John Locke's philosophy, in John Locke's essays on civil government, the two of them, that Locke recognized the right of society to control and to regulate access to private property in order to keep a few people from taking too much, which would deny access to other people. And Locke's position is that it is the right, it is the requirement for society itself to maintain opportunity for everybody. And if that means limiting access to private property, then government has the right to do that. Roosevelt, in his 1910 speech, I think I said 2010, 1910, Roosevelt, in what he called New Nationalism, advocated a government that had enough power to guarantee to every citizen a square deal. And Roosevelt becomes very famous in the textbooks for his program entitled The Square Deal. But in this speech, in his New Nationalism speech, Roosevelt explains what he means by a square deal. And more importantly, what he doesn't mean by a square deal. He makes it clear, and this is a quote, that fair play under the present rules of the game, unquote, is not enough. That's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about freedom. He's not talking about everybody having the freedom to pursue their own self-interest without any rules or any regulations, let the best man win. That's not what he's talking about. Because he said, if you let the rules of the game as they're presently written operate, then there are a few people who have all the advantages. And they will use the rules of the game to prevail always. The same few will always win, and the same many will always lose. What is needed, Roosevelt argued, was the necessity, quote, of having those rules changed, unquote, so that equal opportunity for all really did exist, or at least come close to existing. And this is a quote from that speech by Theodore Roosevelt. The true friend of property, Roosevelt said, the true conservative, is he who insists that property is the servant and not the master of the Commonwealth, unquote. Property is the servant and not the master of the Commonwealth. Government's job is to protect people more than it is property. Conservatives consider that speech to be radical, that perspective to be radical, because they argue that property is an unalienable right that comes from God. Hell, it's not. It is a right that comes to people who live in a particular society because the way that society operates, the rules of the game, so to speak, have made it possible for them to do very well. And because they have done very well, they have accumulated significant influence and power. And they use that influence and power to write the rules of the game in such a way that only they can win. Roosevelt said, if that's what's going on, then you got to change the rules. Because too many people lose if you don't. And government standing back and letting this happen without doing anything is a violation of government's interest or government's mission to protect the public interest, to promote the general welfare. But Theodore Roosevelt is Theodore Roosevelt. He was the president. One of the most interesting things about his New Nationalism speech, and I encourage you to look at it, is that at the very beginning of that speech, Roosevelt quotes Abraham Lincoln, chapter and verse, in order to lay the groundwork for many of the arguments and many of the points he's going to make. Why would he choose Lincoln to quote? Because Lincoln is the darling of conservatives. Lincoln's the guy more than anybody else. As Roosevelt said, if I said the things that Lincoln said, they'd call me, he says this right in the speech, if I said the things that Lincoln said, they'd call me a socialist. But they won't call Lincoln a socialist. So he quotes Lincoln. Well, let me use that same analogy. Theodore Roosevelt, in his speech in 1910, saying, if I said many of the things that Lincoln said, I'd be accused of being a socialist. Bernie Sanders is saying many of those things in 2016, and he's being accused of being a socialist. And what I think is the most powerful defense of Sanders at all that we could find is that I'm not going to Abraham Lincoln to challenge those who call Sanders a socialist. I'm going to James Madison, who wrote the Constitution of the United States. James Madison advocated many of the very same things that Bernie Sanders is advocating. I don't think you can call James Madison a socialist. All you need to do is look at the Heritage Foundation website and look at the number of times and the number of places that conservative spokesmen cite James Madison and James Madison's defense of individual freedom as the very foundation of this nation. Madison made the argument in Federalist Number 10 that to take away people's freedom is a cure worse, because freedom produces factions, is a cure worse than the disease. That would be like, Madison said in Federalist Number 10, that would be like eliminating fire because it causes destruction. You can't eliminate air because it feeds fire. You can't eliminate freedom because it supports factions, Madison is saying. Conservatives cite this and therefore claim James Madison as one of the greatest defenders in the nation's history of individual freedom, which of course they claim to be the basic foundation of free enterprise capitalism. Madison did do that in Federalist Number 10. But he did other things as well. He looked at the system, at the nation, and the challenges that the nation faced with a much more balanced, much more measured perspective than any of these people do who cite him. They go to one place, one issue that he focused on, blow it way out of proportion, and basically claim that James Madison argues that free enterprise capitalism is the best and the only system in the world. It seems to me that you probably can make that argument about James. I'm not arguing that James Madison is anti-capitalism. On the contrary, he's not. But Madison is in favor of a government in a republic that can work. And he wrote the Constitution of the United States to meet those demands. To structure a government in a republic where most Americans accepted the values of republicanism and set out to create a government that could work in those systems. And if one of the problems, Madison said in Number 10, is faction, that granted, if you take away people's freedom, you'll eliminate the threat of faction. But Madison said to do that, to take away people's freedom, is worse than the disease. You don't want to do that. Yesterday, we started to look at the 1829 letter that Madison wrote on property. I'd like to go back a little bit and cite a letter that Madison wrote some years earlier in the National Gazette, 1792 to be specific. It's a letter that we looked at in some detail in previous recent weeks. in our consideration of two parties. And you'll recall that in 1792, Madison wrote two major letters on parties in America. The first one he wrote in January of 92. The second one he wrote in September of 92. The second one is entitled A Candid State of Party in America, in which he talks about the split in Congress between the Hamiltonian Federalists and an emerging Republican group that he himself is helping to create. In the first letter, the one that Madison writes in January, he lays out a strategy that he argues government must follow in order to guarantee that republicanism will work. If Republican government is to work in America, Madison is saying, government must do these things. And there are 5 of them. 2 of the 5 deal with the issue of private property and government's power to regulate it, and government's responsibility to the citizenship, to the citizenry at large, as opposed to its obligation to property. In his second point, Madison advocates as one thing that government must do, quote, withholding unnecessary opportunities from a few to increase the inequality of property by an immoderate and especially an unmerited accumulation of riches, unquote. Translation, Madison says what government has to do is make sure that it doesn't provide opportunities to the few to accumulate even more property when they already have more than everybody else. I would say that what Madison is saying there is that government can never let the private sector write tax policy. And that's what we allowed to happen. We let the people who had the expertise and the vast amount of property in this country, we let them dictate tax policy in this country. What would be a loophole? Where private property owners would get breaks on taxes, where they could write off capital gains and all this other stuff, which has produced a 6,000-page tax code in this country. Madison is saying in 1792, government can't do that. You can't allow the people who already have all the advantages to write the rules to lock in those advantages so nobody else can get them and they can get more. So government's job is to withhold unnecessary opportunities from a few to increase the inequality of property by an immoderate and especially unmerited accumulation of riches. You can't let them even have more, Madison is saying. You can't give them the opportunity to do that. You've got to deny them that opportunity and make them work like everybody else works. That's the first thing. But before I get to the second thing, what does that say about what Bernie Sanders is saying? He's saying break up the banks, regulate Wall Street. Don't let them have even more, for God's sake. It's exactly the same thing that James Madison is saying. He goes on with the next point. And he said the next thing government must do is, quote, by a silent operation of the laws. In other words, very unobtrusively, behind the scenes, not out in the open where everybody can see it, but very importantly, even though unobtrusively, by a silent operation of the laws, Madison said, reduce extreme wealth towards a state of mediocrity, and raise extreme indigence towards a state of comfort without violating the laws of property, unquote. Madison is saying we're not going to violate the laws of property. We're not going to be socialists. Government's not going to take control of all private property. We're not going there, he said. But what we are doing is using every opportunity we can without calling a lot of attention to it, to reduce extreme wealth toward a state of mediocrity. In other words, every place we can, put pressure from the top down that keeps under containment, under some control, the amount of property that the wealthy have, in order to minimize inequality. And at the same time, raise extreme indigence towards a state of comfort. Lift up those from the bottom. So if you think about what Madison is saying, you squeeze from the top and you squeeze from the bottom up, and you create mediocrity. You reduce inequality in every way that you can do, but you don't make a big deal of it. You don't call all that much attention to it. You just do it. What he's talking about here is redistributing wealth. Finding ways to help out the people at the bottom and doing it in ways that takes it from the people at the top, but recognizing they've got so much that they can afford it. That's what progressive taxation is about. But the private sector has rewritten all the tax laws and written in loopholes to the principle of progressive taxation. So there's serious question as to whether our tax laws are progressive at all anymore. Mitt Romney paid 13% taxes in 2011. None of us can get by. I live on retirement, and I'm paying 27% income taxes on a combination of what I have been able to put away in retirement, and I have to, once I take it out of my retirement, I have to pay taxes on it because it was tax-free when I put it in. And that added to my Social Security adds up to my tax rate, which is a hell of a lot more than Mitt Romney's 13%, let me tell you, with a lot less income to show for it. So that's what Madison is saying in 1792 that government must do if Republican government is to work in America. That is exactly the same kinds of things that Bernie Sanders is advocating. Exactly. It's the same kind of thing that Hoppy Kercheval said was socialism when he was attacking Bernie Sanders for it. But it's not. Madison said all of this is without violating the laws of property. It's years before Madison gets back to the issue of private property. That's 1792. He writes those letters. In 1829, he's advocating the suspension of property qualifications for office holding and voting in order to make the vote, the right to vote, available to more people. The heads of households, the heads of families, adult white males, obviously, we know that. not everybody, adult white males, but they don't have to own a certain amount of property in order to vote. And Madison's reason that he supports this, because in 1829, it's becoming quite obvious that more and more people in this society don't own property and likely never will own property, because they're working for minimum wages. They're working for wages, and they're working in a society where employers have everything in the world to gain by paying them as little as they can get away with. So they'll never be property owners, Madison believes. His concern, that I would argue is a concern, but that's not Madison's concern. Madison's concern is, what's to keep these people from becoming revolutionaries? If these people have nothing and have no opportunity ever to get anything, why should they remain good citizens? Why should they obey the laws? It's not doing anything for them. Madison believes that by giving these people the right to vote, letting them have a say in the laws that are written, by voting for the people who write them, that the right to vote will at least in part replace property as the vested interest or the kind of stake in society that guarantees and ensures good government in America. And in order to defend his position on this, Madison shares his thoughts on a changing society where more and more people don't own property and fewer people do, and what you need to do to plan for that kind of a nation. And Madison says, as we looked at this quote yesterday, that we live in a world where everybody is not going to be a farmer and grow their own food. Everybody's not going to be self-sufficient or subsistent. More and more people are going to depend on other people to feed them. So therefore, we, Madison is saying, have to find a way to ensure that these people without property, which was always the ingredient or the variable that kept them in line, we need to find a new way to accomplish that. And the new way is the right to vote. He said it is a lot of humanity that of the surplus, a large proportion is reduced necessarily by a competition for employment to wages which afford them the bare necessities of life. The proportion being without property or the hope of ever acquiring it cannot be expected to sympathize sufficiently with its rights to be safe depositories of power over them. In other words, when most of your people don't have property and only a few do, it strains reason, it strains the mind to believe that people without property will continue to defer to those with property to make all the decisions, to write all the rules. It was fine to have property being the key to the rule makers before, when most people could own it. Most people could be property owners. But now, as the nation is moving in a direction where most people are not going to own property and probably never will, you can't expect them to continue to defer to the property, to the wealthy, to make all the rules. You got to find something else. And that something else is the right to vote. And so that's why he advocates giving the right to vote to the heads of families and housekeepers, most of whom, he says, have, quote, given hostages to fortune. In other words, if they're the heads of households or the housekeepers or the heads of families, they're already committed to the goals of the idea you got to have a budget, you got to take care of your family, your responsibilities, etc. They already bought into this, Madison is saying. Now we need to find a way to add country to that, so that the same commitment they have to their personal families, they'll have to the country as well. And the way to do it is to let them participate by voting. And then he tells us what this will accomplish. He says, this portion of the community, the very poor who don't own property, but are heads of households and now have the right to vote, this portion of the community, added to those who, although not possessed of a share of the soil, are deeply interested in other species of property, investments, banks, financial institutions. In other words, you take the poor that you've given the vote to, you add them to the people that don't own land, but own other kinds of property, like investments, stocks, those kinds of things. And both of them added to the territorial proprietors, the ones who own all the land, who in a certain sense may be regarded as the owners of the country itself. These added together form the safest basis of free government. You take the property owners, you take the investors who are investing in different kinds of property, and then you take the very poor who don't own any property but have the right to vote anyway. You add them together, and that is the safest basis of free government. That's the group that you need to rely on. Madison says, it would be happy if a state of society could be found or framed in which an equal voice in making the laws might be allowed to every individual bound to obey them. In other words, it would be great if we had the kind of society where everybody would be the same. Everybody who was expected to obey the laws would be given equal power. That's socialism. That would be socialism. Madison said, wouldn't that be great? It would be happy, he says. But he says this is a theory which, like most theories, confessedly requires limitations and modifications. We can't get there. And the only question to be decided in this, as in other cases, turns on the particular degree of departure in practice required by the essence and object of the theory itself. We can't get there to perfect communism, he's saying. You can't get to a society where everybody is exactly the same, everybody's exactly equal, everybody has exactly the same power and exactly the same influence. That's a theory. It's a dream. It's not real. You can't get there. But what you can do is you can make the kinds of modifications that give you an opportunity to move in that direction. And that's the way Madison explains it. He says, and this is where we stopped yesterday, How far this view of the subject will be affected by the Republican laws of descent and distribution in equalizing the property of citizens and in reducing to the minimum mutual surpluses for mutual supplies cannot be inferred from any direct and adequate experiment. What he's saying is already we've changed the rules of inheritance so that large estates of the very wealthy can't be passed on to the next generation. At least they're broken up. And the amount of money left, or the heirs, all receive something, rather than the whole estate being required by law to be passed on to the eldest son. Already, he said, we've changed the rules of inheritance and distribution in the direction of republicanism. And it's hard to tell, he said, exactly how much that's going to contribute to the goals that we're after. One result of that, he said, would seem to be a deficiency of the capital for the expensive establishments which facilitate labor and cheapen its products on the one hand, and on the other, the capacity to purchase the costly and ornamental articles consumed by the wealthy alone. Translation, Madison said one effect of this, by breaking up estates in the laws of inheritance, is to spread the wealth around, redistribute the wealth. So that instead of a few people with the power to buy everything, all the luxuries and things that the wealthy are used to being able to buy, the result is that more people are able, you're creating a consumer society. By redistributing wealth, you're empowering more and more people to become consumers of goods. Thereby, you're creating jobs. You're creating the opportunity for more and more people to get jobs making the things that there are more and more people to buy. This is exactly what Franklin D. Roosevelt talked about in the New Deal, is putting money into people's pockets in order to create demand so that producers could produce. Madison said, another advantage or outcome, the increased mass of laborers added to the production of necessities by the withdrawal for this object of a part of those now employed in producing luxuries, and the addition to the laborers from the class of present consumers of luxuries. One result would seem to be a deficiency of capital for the expensive establishments which facilitate labor and cheapen its products on the one hand, and on the other, the capacity to purchase the costly and ornamental articles consumed by the wealthy alone, who must cease to be idlers and must become laborers. By redistributing the wealth in these ways, you minimize the number of people who can afford to live in the lack of luxury and never work, who can afford to live a lifetime as idlers. You force more people to become laborers. Government's policies of descent, of inheritance, by breaking up estates and spreading the wealth around, make it necessary for more people to work, rather than just to create a group of inheritors who'll just receive all they need in life and never have to work another day in their lives. It's like hitting Powerball for them. Madison said government's job in the Republican laws of descent and distribution is to break up the wealth and spread it around so more people can work, more people can find jobs producing what consumers want to consume, more people will be required to work and less people be allowed to loaf. Isn't this exactly what Roosevelt was talking about? Isn't this exactly what Bernie Sanders is talking about? The difference is this is what James Madison is talking about. I think that this is incredibly important. I really believe that what we have here is a very significant finding. I believe that we've wandered into something here which could conceivably change the whole nature of political dialogue in our nation. Let me be blunt and maybe a little bit overstate this, but we only have 5 or 6 minutes left in our program, so it seems to me that I don't have enough time. I have enough time to get myself into trouble, but I don't have enough time to get myself out of it. So let me go out on a limb and say what really is kind of perking around in my mind. The reason that I got so excited about this Madison stuff is that I believe in ways that I never allowed myself to believe before, that what we have here in James Madison is a justification for progressivism as the legitimate direction that this nation ought to be going in. We have allowed, throughout our history, we have allowed the wealthy and the prosperous and the influential to call the shots. We have allowed them to define truth. We have allowed them to define and write our past to suit themselves. We have allowed them to cherry pick the evidence in order to support the economic theory and the kind of system that benefits them most. And the way we've allowed them to do it is we have allowed them to label those who advocate something different as radicals or as socialists or as communists or as spoiled, lazy, do-nothing, spoiled students. In other words, we have allowed those with the most to lose with change to define reality, and we have allowed them to define those people who question reality as dangers to our society, as radicals, as troublemakers, as socialists, as communists. Theodore Roosevelt himself made the comment when he was receiving all kinds of corporate opposition to his so-called square deal. This is not socialism, Roosevelt argued. This is the shrewdest form of conservatism. If you don't do this, you are creating a larger and larger group of people with no vested interest in the existing system. They will overthrow you. You will have a revolution in this country if you don't do something to minimize inequality and to equalize and make more fair the opportunities available to more people. That's what progressives have been arguing all along. But the fact of the matter is, we have allowed these people to define progressivism as radicals. We have allowed these people to actually belittle liberalism, to create an environment in which people actually apologized for being liberal or being progressive. And the major argument that they have used in their defense, in their arsenal, is freedom, individual freedom, defending freedom, expanding freedom, fighting to defend freedom around the world, bringing freedom to the people that don't have it, without ever getting into the question of what the hell they mean by freedom. What they mean is their freedom. What they mean by right to work is their right to control the workplace by taking away the rights of people who work in it. That's what they mean by right to work. That's what they mean by workplace freedom, their freedom, not the freedom of the people who work there. But these folks also endorse or support an educational system which denies young people access to the kind of information and the kind of education which would allow them to understand this. And the result is that this nation is falling further and further behind in so many different ways. That in desperation here in West Virginia in today's election, desperate West Virginians are being asked to turn to a millionaire, to a billionaire. And basically his argument is the only way to beat the billionaires is to offset them with another billionaire. And so people are being asked to turn to the rich good guys in order to fight off the rich bad guys. That's not what this republic is about, folks. That's not what James Madison put together in the Constitution of the United States. And we better begin to turn things around. And I believe this material from the hand of James Madison does it. I really believe that this is the beginning of a turnaround. We now have evidence. We now have ammunition. No longer do we have to let these people define what we are. We can proudly stand up and tell other people what we are and what we believe and why we believe it, and we can go to James Madison to back us up. We don't need to go no further than Bernie Sanders, or even to Theodore Roosevelt, or even to Abraham Lincoln. We can go all the way back to James Madison, who created this system and explained exactly what was necessary to make it work. And then we can see what these people who are not out for our best interests are trying to do to that system. It is 3 o'clock. We have reached the end of our program. I want to thank you for tuning into the Virtual Center. Have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other and join us again tomorrow. Thank you.